Hello everyone. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Peace be upon you all. Hi. So my name is Hamd Al-Ayoub and I'll be your moderator today. This is a panel discussion on religion and society. So the format of today's panel discussion is as follows. So each speaker will get to get a short opening statement. Then the speakers will get a chance to question each other or ask each other's questions for as long as they'd like, and then following that we can open the floor for the audience to ask questions. We'll just kickstart that by having the speakers introduce themselves, starting from the right, from your right.
I'm Jason Conroy, doing law with history here, second year, UCD. I'm representing the Catholics with Newman Society, and yes, very busy, exams coming up.
Abdullah Andalusi, no exams coming up. Co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative. As our name suggests, we initiate debates, and we're Muslim.
It's very clear. My name is Kent Chadwick. I also don't have exams, haven't in a long time. Thank God. I'm a friend of the Bahai Society of UCD.
I'm Shane. I'm a second year English and philosophy student, sort of. And I don't know if I have exams coming up yet. And I'm with the Atheist and Secular Society.
My name's Scott Evans. I'm the Church of Ireland chaplain on campus, and that's who I am.
Alright, we'll just kick it off with the opening statements. So we'll start with Shane.
So it's really, really great that everyone came. So thank you very much. It's good to show kind of interest in this topic in particular. Just a little bit of housekeeping for the atheist and kind of secular position. As we'll be speaking about the role of religion in society, and I'll be critiquing that role. I must first say what I think is actually good for society. And a common point of critique against atheists is that we have no objective basis by which we can judge what is good for society at all. This is true insofar as atheists generally, and myself certainly, don't base morality on absolute values, yet we can still have a metric for what's good in society. To steal from the good Mr. Al-Andalusi here, he says in one of his lectures, I can't remember the context, he asked what was a good car, and eventually he teased out of his audience that a good car is one that fundamentally is one that works. The same is true of society in a way. When we say that things like rape, murder, theft, kind of cognitive miserliness, uncritical capacities, competition, bad ideologies sometimes including religion, are all harmful to the functioning of society insofar as it hinders the objective of society, occasionally, to improve the lives of people. Another problem we all face when criticizing each other here today is that it's difficult to analyze religion's role in society as it doesn't really exist in a vacuum. Studying the cultural and political context, which is immensely complicated, and how religion fits in is extremely difficult and very difficult to understand. And yet, were we to cite the inevitable example of Islamism, while those involved in violence might very well be motivated to violence by political agendas, such as hatred in the West and retaliation for the wrongdoing of Western foreign policy, which is reasonable, it is religion that plays a crucial role in motivating them to violence. Even if their opinions are contradictory, and that's very important, even if their opinions are contradictory. The notion of fighting for love of one's country is certainly enough to motivate people to kill. I'm not arguing the point, it's very obvious, but it will always be much more persuasive to say that it is God Almighty at your back, rather than a nation or some charismatic leader. Of course, God can be very difficult to criticize when people are obsessed and really devout and their religion gives them extreme comfort. They're very attached to the idea. We can say then that religion, especially when added to the anger that I've described, can hinder the critical capacity, which would give people the uncertainty to stay their hands rather than the certainty to know what they're doing is right no matter what. That's an extreme example, obviously. Going back to the previous problem of finding it difficult to critique religion in isolation, it is perhaps the case with Scott and Abdullah that I find this problem. It is very easy, on the other hand, to attack the Vatican and the Universal House of Justice, which is the administrative body of the Baha'is. It's based in Haifa in Israel. Coming now to where religion certainly influences society and some problems therein, the House is fairly new, and the only thing I have on it really is that there's one board of authority with a male-only policy. And I don't really fully understand it, but there's a very articulate response for it generally. The Vatican, on the other hand, we have significant opposition to civil freedoms in this country for sure. We can cite examples like condoms, divorce, etc. On the other side of the Atlantic, we have an example of Cardinal Bernard Law, who was the Archbishop of Boston and was complicit in shielding priests who were pedophiles. And then after a pseudo-shameful resignation, which is on the Vatican website, was appointed to be the vicar of Santa Maria Church in Rome. And in 2005, rather, was someone voting for the next pope in conclave. To say nothing of the destructive lie that condoms, for example, do not prevent the spreading of AIDS, and a sundry list of crimes that the church, or rather there is a sundry list of crimes that the church has committed. What I glean from this is that religious institutions are dangerous at times, at least when allowed to direct the course of society. I'm not saying it's necessarily true of just religion. I think there are many ideologies which function similarly. But I can think of few better arguments for secularism than the Vatican. And I will conclude that with a secular outlook, and you can be a Christian secularist as well, or a Muslim, or any kind of religious secularist, not necessarily an atheistic one, but a secular outlook assesses issues on their impact, good or ill, on society and for people therein, rather than matching up with theology. And I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'll get you in the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane. We're going to move on to Kent Chadwick.
Hello, everyone. I hate to just sit down and read something that's written, but to make sure I touch on everything, that's probably mostly what I'm going to do to start. So I want to start by giving just the wider context of who the Baha'is are and what they believe, because I'm sure it's generally less well known among the population in general and probably the people in the room tonight. So that's my starting point. The Baha'i faith affirms belief in one God, the God of Israel, the God of the Gospel, the God of the Quran. One creator that has manifested his will to mankind through successive revelations, guiding the progress of civilization. A God exalted beyond human capacity to understand or describe, but who makes his will known through great teachers, who provide the spiritual stimulus and the means for cooperation and the progress of society. Humanity comes to know God through the teachings of these great luminaries, the founders of the world's great religions, most of whose names are familiar to all of us: Abraham, Buddha, Moses, Christ, Muhammad. And Baha'is are the followers of Baha'u'llah, whom they believe to be the most recent of these great educators, but not the last. Baha'u'llah taught that the relationship between God and his messengers was like that between the sun and perfectly polished mirrors. That while humanity could not approach the transcendent reality of God, we could come to know his will, at least in part, through the light that shone in these mirrors. When we look at them, the prophets or the messengers of God, we see the light of God. This is why Baha'u'llah calls them the manifestations of God. They manifest his light with perfect clarity, while he remains, God that is, above and beyond the reach of mortal minds. Baha'u'llah taught that God's will has been gradually unfolded to mankind through progressive revelation, that the many diverse religions of the world are not competing claimants to truth, but are all part of one unfolding story, one continuous revelation. Religious teachings are of two kinds, the essential and the social. The differences in the various social teachings of these religions are due to the differing capacity and circumstances of the time in which they were revealed. The essential teachings, however, are universal and have always been the same, reiterated again and again throughout history: love, justice, peace, selfless service to others. So the question we're examining tonight is the role of religion in society. So that's the description of what Baha'is see the interaction of religion with society as over time historically. And we believe that religion is the very creative impulse of society. It is the source of values, giving shape to the aspirations of our intellect and our scientific pursuits. Through scientific endeavor, the human mind comes to understand the universe and harness its resources in the service of civilization. And religion is a vital parallel system of knowledge that has given us the values to progress toward an ultimate goal, a unified and peaceful world. And so I hope to get into this in a little more detail later, that science, or our rational minds, we do not believe are in a dichotomous relationship with a religious sensibility or spirituality. That they are parallel and complementary systems of knowledge that have actually much more in common than we typically acknowledge in the general discourse. Now, I don't want to take any of the other panelists' arguments away from them, but of course we have to acknowledge that much evil has been done in the name of religion. That's clear and evident. But we, the Baha'i faith, maintains that religion has always been the source of the sincerest values and the noblest aspirations of mankind, and that it has provided the tools and the framework to build a just and peaceful world. And just like any other ideology that we can think of, a tool not used for its intended purpose can cause harm. And the same would be true of religion. To quote Baha'u'llah about this relationship between religion and society, he said, "God's purpose in sending his prophets unto men is twofold. The first is to liberate the children of men from the darkness of ignorance and guide them to the light of true understanding. The second is to ensure the peace and tranquility of mankind and provide all the means by which they can be established." Baha'u'llah taught that humanity has reached the age of its maturity, or at least the very dawn and beginning of its maturity. That human history has taken us through a tumultuous growth that can be likened to the progress of a child from its infancy, childhood, adolescence. And we are emerging now into the time where we actually have the capacity to rise to our highest aspirations of nobility. We are recognizing, generally, people, that humanity is one. That we are now a global society. That there's no going back to the fierce tribalism of the past, as much as some people really are trying to do this. Baha'u'llah said that the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. This notion, in his time revolutionary, has become so widely accepted that it's simply accepted as a matter of course. Breaking down the barriers between peoples to achieve enduring peace and justice is a common goal, I would presume, for all of us, from any religious background, from a non-religious background. We want to achieve peace and justice universally. The knocking made me lose my place. I'm all flustered now.
Start again.
Yeah, okay. So we have this common goal, I think, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, of a just, peaceful, unified world. And it's easy to look at the world as it is today and come to the conclusion that we no longer need religion. There are obvious examples to point to of all of the negative aspects and impacts of religion over time. But religion is not simply a collection of beliefs and practices. It's a dynamic force with the ability to transform both the individual and society. And there's never been a time where the question of how we shape our society has been more important, because we are now a global society, and we cannot discard the shared spiritual heritage of our collective experience if we hope to be equipped for a future world society. Thank you.
Thank you, Kent. So we're going to move on to Sheikh Abdullah Al-Andalusi.
Just brother. Just brother Al-Andalusi. Not pretentious to call myself Sheikh or milkshake or any other kind of Sheikh. So firstly, I'd like to thank the audience and the different student union societies for inviting me back to Ireland. I always love coming back to Ireland, if anything but for the delicious steaks that you have here. But Irish beef is amazing. Apologies to any vegans if I've offended you by that statement. Now, whenever we see an event titled Religion in the Modern World or Religion in the 21st Century, contained in the title is an implied context and basically an implied meaning. In the West, context is usually one of an assumed obsolete application in the political affairs of religion. And the discussion is one where usually the panelists or who are adherents of a particular religion seek to argue not that there is any problem with religion, but rather that religion can still have some kind of a utility and that there's still some kind of demand for it, so you shouldn't get rid of it altogether. Arguably, no one questions whether society or the world is better served by a secular system or a secular ideology or any other type of materialistic ideology. Merely that religion may have a use in tempering some of the excesses that occur within materialistic systems, which is usually the line of argument I've seen. But materialistic systems themselves are never really put under scrutiny as ruling systems, as systems that provide purpose or value. But before we can discuss what we mean by a materialistic ideology or a materialistic political system, we have to first ask ourselves, what do we mean by religion? Now, although religion is usually defined as a system of belief related to a god or other deities or spiritual existences, I would prefer a more specific definition: religion as a belief in the metaphysical and its relationship with the physical. Metaphysical just means about the physical, metaphysical from the Greek, or it could also mean beyond the physical. And if we consider such an understanding, you'll discover that most people have a religion, even if they don't believe in God or spirituality. Because anyone who believes in justice, equality, rights, good or bad or evil, believe in things that do not have a physical existence. Show me where in the microscope you can find equality or justice or good or evil. Show me where in the telescope you can find this. It's not in the local galaxy. It doesn't exist except in our minds and except as a value that we put down in books. Books that we base our laws on. Indeed, concepts even such as the nation or the country have no existence outside of our minds. Yet, like any other religion, they have symbols, traditions, practices, and worldviews associated with them. I think if an alien was looking down at Ireland, they wouldn't see the Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, because they'll just see a landmass. It's us that draw the borders and imagine there to be a border and pretend like there is a border, and we have to manage how we go in and out of that border, like you see it between any other nation state in the world. Now, generally people assume that we live in a developed world because we somehow discarded religion. And I always find myself, ironically, as the Muslim defending Christianity here, just looking on the Western context, because that's not actually accurate. The West underwent at least 600 to 700 years of technological development without a secular system. The first universities in the West weren't built by Richard Dawkins' predecessors, unless they were Christian, of course. They were built by the Catholic Church, by Catholics, for example. You have, exactly.
Hell yeah.
You don't need to speak anymore. I'll do your job. I'm going to be the honorary member of the Newman Society now.
Excellent.
Just put my picture on your main
Deal.
room. Anyway, so we see that a lot of development, even the person who first posited the Big Bang, Georges Lemaitre, was a Belgian Catholic priest, of whom Einstein, lauded to be a kind of secular thinker, disagreed with and then was proven wrong. So the priest was right and Einstein was wrong about an aspect of physics. So this has actually been history. And of course you can see that also in the Islamic world. We see that throughout history, Muslims have been at the forefront of science and technology up until our civilization kind of plateaued around the 17th century due to sociological reasons, like the Chinese civilization. You have this cyclical rise and fall of civilizations, but that's a different discussion. But what we see is that also the idea of secularism is very, very new. Because throughout all different nations in the world, people didn't have the idea that your values and beliefs is separate from your laws and society. They were one and the same thing. Whether it's the Romans or the people of the Indus Valley or the Mayans or whichever culture you pick, religion, i.e. your beliefs about the metaphysical, was intimately attached to the physical. But also we have to ask ourselves a question of justice. Has a secular world produced justice through what is lauded to be, or at least touted to be, rational and logical thinking? Well, let's have a look. Recently, just a couple of days ago, Credit Suisse reported that 0.7% of the world's population own 46% of the world's wealth, while the bottom half of the world's population, that's 3.5 billion people, own 2.7% of its wealth between them. Is that fair? We live in an era where it seems where profits are more important than prophets. And consequently, thank you. And consequently, morality, humanity, and conscience go as far only as their estimated utility to capital gains. I would say that religion that posits something that is greater than the material realm is sorely needed today, as it ever has been. The purpose of economics is to distribute wealth. Historically, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism have all prohibited usury, or what we call interest banking today, deeming it to be false trade. One does not exchange a commodity for the exact same commodity, but with greater increase, and could conscionably call it a distribution of resources. But what good can come of a prohibition from God upon the minds of someone who doesn't see it as convenient, who sees it as more convenient and less risky to extort money from people by lending it while placing their properties as collateral? How could you persuade them not to take that individual business transaction that benefits them by exhorting them to God if they don't believe in God or they reject anything more than the material world? What about tolerance? I would also say that the belief that religion causes intolerance is, again, not really true, or not really significant, considering that really it's humans that cause intolerance and not really religion. Because we see that intolerance still perpetuates, and we still see it in the world today. Just to finish off, recent studies showed that even in the 20th century, intolerance is increasing in predominantly secular nationalist countries. Whereas the religion might not be Christianity or Judaism or Hinduism, but it is the secular nation state. And all those minorities which are deemed not to be part of the nation, or to be deemed suspect to the nation state or to the predominant national identity, are deemed to be undesirables, extremists, fifth columnists. And we see this happening in Burma, for example. Burma is not a theocracy, it's a secular nation state. So to kind of round it up, I would say that we don't really see the real question we have to ask ourselves is not whether religion has a place in modern society or whether there's a utility for it, but I think we should ask the question, does modern society meet the aspirations of religion? And I think that's the real question that we have to ask here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Abdallah, for your speech. So can we move on to Chaplain Scott Evans?
Good evening. Yeah. Wow, tough crowd. When it comes to asking the question about the place of religion within modern society, I ask it kind of through two lenses. Like, I'm asking that question, I guess, myself through two lenses. One is, how do we adjust to this new space that we're in? All right. I literally just got going. See, he'll listen to everyone except the Protestant. That's his problem. Don't take that out of my 6 minutes. So what is the place of religion within modern society? Is it? I guess the question I ask myself is it at the center or at the fringe? And I have this immense distrust, speaking from a personal perspective as somebody who's within Christianity. Whenever Christianity comes into a position of power, I'm always hesitant, whether it's looking through the journey of, in the Old Testament, of the freed Israelite slaves who come out of Egypt and come into a promised land. They go from being people who were slaves to being free And then they build a kingdom and they become slave owners. And this is where the problem is, not in the establishing of something where they have religious values that guide and shape their society, but rather as soon as they get to the moment where they begin to build beyond that and they bring slaves in to do it. Solomon and David bring in slaves to build the temple and to build the palace. And as soon as you get into that point, I think, where religion is what is building palaces and temples, where politics and religion are occupy the same space, I think we get into trouble. Which is why I think one of the most lamentable moments in Christian history is the moment at which Constantine, apparently at a battle, looked to the sky and saw the clouds in the shape of a cross and heard the word of God, heard God say to him, "In this sign conquer." How can you conquer in the name of the Prince of Peace? It makes no sense. And it's antithetical, I think, to what Jesus teaches us in the Gospels. And for me, when it comes to trying to figure out what the place of my faith looks like in the society in which I live, and even within this community, the question, I think, is best answered by Jesus in terms of what his relationship was with the political authorities of his day. Jesus never thought to overthrow, to usurp Pilate and gain influence within the Roman Empire. He never sought to overthrow King Herod. Welcome back. He never sought to overthrow Herod and become king of Israel. That was never what he did. Instead, he always found himself on the margins, moving in a space with those who are most vulnerable. Preaching a message and bringing parables about the kingdom of God coming that would not destroy empire, but rather would revolutionize society. It's an entirely different way of being, and I think that this is. There's many within my traditions who lament the loss of power within Christianity, and it's something that I don't lament at all. There was a pride of place that we used to own, but I'm the Church of Ireland, the former church of the oppressor in Ireland, and whether it's the Protestant tradition or the Catholic tradition, we have a sticky history in Ireland, and it's evangelicals, Christian evangelicals, who are mostly responsible for Trump taking hold in America. Like we got a lot to answer for, because we're not good with power, but I think we can be good with the prophetic. That we can be the voice on the margins, or as John the Baptist was called, the voice in the wilderness, crying, "Prepare you the way of the Lord," creating a different space, a different way of being. And so therefore, to step away from power is to step away from judgment. There's this beautiful story that Henry Nouwen tells about an abbot living in the middle of a town where he was called to cast judgment over a young woman who had an unexpected pregnancy. And they knocked on his door and they said, Abbot, come and pronounce judgment. And he said, "No, I won't do it." And they kept knocking on his door and said, come. And so eventually he did it. But when he did, he came out with, and he brought with him a bucket full of water that had holes in it. And he walked it through the abbey and out into the town. And the people asked him, "What are you doing with this bucket?" And he said, "How can I come and pronounce judgment over this other person when my sin flows out behind me? My imperfection, my incompleteness, my brokenness. I aspire to the values, to these ethics, to this way of living, but I do not put myself in the place as judge over others." For me, there's a subjectivity about my faith. I believe certain things about life, relationship, community, forgiveness, whether or not I should have enemies, whether or not I should gain wealth, my relationship with sex, my relationship with power, my relationship with ego. But all of those things are part of a complex network of beliefs that I have, and I would hate to enforce those beliefs on other people. I don't want to put people in the destination that I'm finding myself in if they haven't been on the journey that I'm on. And so I think the place of religion is to invite people into a journey about what this life means and what it looks like to live it well, and to invite people to the conversation that journey brings, and that's what religion offers us. But not to enforce our destination on others when they haven't walked the same road that we have. Because that, I think, can be a way in which we can live on the prophetic fringe, always asking better questions, rather than falsely promising we can deliver a better society, when power tends to be the thing that we destroy with, rather than build with. We're better at the edges, because, at least for me, that's where I feel like my God has called me to.
Thank you, Chaplain Scott. So we're going to move on to our last speaker, Jason.
All right, so I'm going to be speaking, kind of representing the Catholic Church here today, or Catholicism, that kind of thing. So I guess, first off, let's start off. What is the Catholic Church? It's the world's oldest organization. It's the second, I've got my facts here, it's the second biggest, it's the second largest international development body after the UN. It's the second largest international humanitarian aid body after the Red Cross. What does it teach? I guess the church is always I'm going to be mainly addressing the points brought up, I suppose, by my atheist friend here. What does the church teach? I guess, well, I'm going to try and show that it's been a force for progressive values in society rather than a regressive boogeyman trying to take away people's civil liberties and freedoms and trying to oppress minorities and groups of people. So I'm just going to dive right into it and start off with the points that were kind of made in the first speech here. So religion as a legitimate, hinders the critical faculty is what the claim made about religion. Well, I don't think I need to say much about that because as my distinguished colleagues have kind of mentioned already, there's not really any coherent conflict between faith and science, and really much of I was just pointing out by my good Muslim friend here. For example, the guy who came with the Big Bang theory was a Catholic priest. So there's not. It's a fallacy to say that religion and rational thought are two conflicting, contradictory things, because the majority of the greatest minds over the past 2,000 years, and even longer than that, have all been religious people. You've got even theologians like Thomas Aquinas, some of the great theologians, and he relied on great theologians from the Islamic Golden Age as well. I know you had monks preserving ancient classical texts from the Roman Empire. Well after the Roman Empire had ended, they were preserving them, and also it was Islamic scholars as well who preserved the texts of ancient Greek philosophers, and it was Catholic monks who preserved ancient Roman texts, and that's why we have the Renaissance today. That was one of the big things that led to the scientific enlightenment, and we have, it was people rediscovering these texts which had been preserved by religious people. So I think history kind of shows that there's no big necessary conflict between religion and rationality. There's some examples, for example, Westboro Baptists and maybe America, or people who are fundamentalists of any sort, really. They generally tend to scorn reason and rationality. But you don't even have to be religion to do that, of course, because my next point is going to show, all sorts of non-religious people have still managed to find ways to be extremists and fundamentalists over the years, and so they show that really there's not really any integral connection between religion and that. Because another point that was brought up was that religious institutions are dangerous when allowed to influence the direction of society. And religious influence society, opposition to civil freedoms, condoms and divorce were all brought up. First, I guess this is about religion and society. One of the main points we're going to be talking about is, has religion been a positive influence in society over the years? My main point would be to point out, my first point to point out would be that, let's look at the recent history we've had over the past 100 years, or 117 years at this stage, in the 1900s. Some of the most brutal, oppressive regimes we've ever seen in history. I think it's essentially the biggest bloodshed ever in human history. It was instigated by regimes whose first order of call was to prohibit and suppress all religious speech. That was the regime in Germany, the regime in Russia, and Pol Pot in Asia, Mao's China. Millions and millions of people died by some of the first firmly, resolutely, radically secular societies in the world. So I think that kind of suggests certain things from history that maybe religion does have something to contribute here. So let's look at some of the history as well on civil rights and whatnot. I'd like to kind of make the point that, contrary to popular knowledge, popular belief, the Catholic Church has really a very good track record in terms of civil rights and civil liberties in the past. Just to give a few examples, the first proponent of rights for native Africans and Native Americans during the colonial eras in the 1500s was the Portuguese, I think it was Portuguese or Spanish, Dominican Las Casas, and he was basically brought his case before the King of Spain, I think, and made the case that these are human beings, they have natural rights, they have human rights. So one of the first human rights scholars and lawyers in the world, a Catholic priest, a religious brother, completely religious, and he uses reason to do it, and he fought for the rights of natives when they were being oppressed by everyone else. Of course, that didn't really see realization, of course, because, as we know, it's one thing to have the law. He succeeded in getting the law changed. It's one thing to have the law changed in Spain, though. It's another thing for the slave drivers and the plantationers in the colonies to actually put them into effect when they're directly losing from that. So, as we've seen, as kind of been covered already, there's always lots of room for human beings to mess up at what they do. So, I think that's just the human condition. What else? The Vatican as well. I mean, the Vatican came up as one of the main kind of like a sinister institution, kind of covering up abuses and spreading reactionary, anti-human ideology. The Vatican was one of the main the Pope over the years was one of the main people who spoke out against slavery for literally hundreds of years, constantly denouncing it, the slave trade, from as early as the 14 or 1500s. I mean, it was the influence of the Catholic Church that eventually, Roman society before Christianity was, a society built on slavery and inequality, and by the Middle Ages, slavery was basically not a thing anymore, and that was the gradual influence of the Church which denounced slavery. And then, of course, the slave trade came up again in the early modern era in 14 and 1500s, and the Pope constantly denounced that as well. The Vatican saved hundreds of thousands and thousands of Jews during the Second World War. They denounced Hitler's regime. But the main thing is, well, how is that relevant to society today? And yes, as the other speakers have kind of covered already, society benefits when it's kind of held up to a kind of, some transcendental ideals, some like high values that are absolute, that are above all of us, that are something that we're all called to. I guess some of the situations like condoms and divorce, I just say that like any other group in society, like one of the main things of our pluralistic, open, democratic society is that everyone's allowed to try and have open and free discussion, debate about what's the best way to move things forward. I mean, we're all talking about common values here. We all want human flourishing, and that's our goal as much as anyone else's. So look for the common good, which is good for everyone and which everyone benefits by. And it's just the freedom, like one of the most essential freedoms in our society, is for people to apply what their own convictions are about the nature of the world, nature of life, nature of humanity, and what they think is best for the human person. And I guess that's just what we're seeing kind of take effect in our modern days, that there's a dialogue going on. People should be able to kind of follow their beliefs and follow their conscience as well, and do what they think is right. So that's kind of what I'd say to, the role of the church, or even any other religious institution in the world. And just one last thing before I finish up, just the question of AIDS in Africa, which I love to address this, because it's such a common misconception that the Vatican or the Church or whatever has kind of harmed Africans by saying that the best way to prevent or stop AIDS is abstinence and not the use of condoms, when empirical studies have shown that the most effective way to combat the AIDS epidemic, and this is in practice, this is in some areas of instituted handing out mass birth control, and other areas of instituted teaching people abstinence and kind of monogamy and relationships, that kind of thing. It's shown that the abstinence program has been far more effective than the just handing out contraception en masse to people at trying to limit the spread of this deadly disease. So I just think that fact check there on that little one, and I'm sure there's a lot more that's going to come up. Oh yeah, and a sundry list of crimes, Liz Cruz. We can talk about that more. I'd like to see what ones in particular you're referring to. Yes, let's. Great. Thank you. That's all.
So we'll allow the speakers to ask each other questions if they'd like.
If I may, I'll go first.
That was very quick.
Thank you. Further on my housekeeping thing with my opening speech, I was just I mentioned that there's no central authority, as I sense at the very least, not counting like a book. I'm talking about an administrative body with Islam. So I was wondering if Mr. Abdullah Al-Andalusi yourself would give me an example of an Islamic state that you do identify with and that you can agree with. You mentioned that Islamic civilization up until the 17th century was reasonable. I imagine you have some issues with it. You don't think it's perfect. I was just wondering if you could cite any examples, such that I could criticize.
Sorry, what was the question? I couldn't actually hear it.
Oh, sorry, pardon me. I was speaking this way. I apologize. I was asking if he could provide an actual Islamic state, a state which he could reasonably say is performing to an Islamic standard, so that he cannot cite no true Scotsman, if you know what I mean. He can't just say that they're just being bad Muslims. Okay.
Sure. Well, for 1,300 years, we've had caliphates. So the concept of a caliphate is a little different from the Catholic conception of the church, or established church, in that the caliph is the political leader enacting Islam's legal ordinances, but does not have the authority to dictate theological interpretation. And so is not the leader of the Muslim church, but is rather the administrator or executive of God's law. So much more akin to I suppose an Old Testament king, to use an analogy there. And of course, utopias are impossible. They can't exist because humans are fallible and corruptible and come in different shapes and sizes. So there are many cases which go against Islam, but what you'll find throughout Islamic history is that whenever a caliph has acted unrighteously and unjustly, he's always been condemned by Islamic scholars. In fact, we have a separation of legal jurisprudence from state. So while the state implements Islamic jurisprudence, the jurisprudence themselves are independent of the state. So it's not secularism per se, because obviously the law itself is divine in origin, but it was functionally there was a separation to check powers, and of course the caliph was subject to the laws of the land, so he could be taken to court. The last caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, at least 11 caliphs or Ottoman caliphs were impeached by you might call the Constitutional Court, or we call the Sheikh al-Islam, due to various infractions. One was mad, one did injustice, and so on, and they were impeached from their position because they contradicted the Islamic ordinances. That hasn't always been able to be achieved, but generally speaking, you had levels of coexistence, of peace, of tolerance in the Middle East that literally do not exist today in the modern world. Oldest churches in the world are in the Middle East. Synagogues, Christians, Muslims, Jews live side by side together. They weren't just tolerated, they were accepted. You had interfaith debates and discussions where you had prominent Christians, for example, Baghdad is a very famous place for these debates, and atheists, a lot of atheists in Baghdad for some reason, openly criticizing Islam in public debate. And this is in medieval Baghdad, So this is the kind of circumstance you see. So you can please point any examples you want, and I will show you from Islamic basis and from contemporary to that time how it was condemned.
Okay. Thank you very much for your forthrightness. I was curious with regards to whether or not you view the Shia scholars, for example, as examples of scholars condemning. Sorry. Pardon. Yeah, I was again speaking to him. I forgot to panel. Yeah, I was going to ask them because obviously the Shia are a distinctive and very large minority in Islam, who have a dissenting opinion on the very first Caliph of Islam. So, would you agree that there is some warranted criticism there? For example, and a second question would be further to your knowledge, is it Islamic or Quranic to declare war and to undergo conquest?
Okay, so the first point about the Shia schools of thought. So in classical Shia discourses, while they didn't recognize the Sunni caliph as legitimate because their conception of who should be a caliph is the descendants of specific members of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They said only these people can be caliphs because they are sinless and they've been designated by God to be so. So they had the 12 members and so on. Now, their understanding of the kind of Sunni caliphate was that they say that while they view the Sunni caliph as, in essence, a usurper, however, the Islamic laws and regulations, ordinances, they actually agreed with. So in that sense, the Islamic scholarship you saw coming from Shia scholars was one whereby a Shia could participate and cooperate with and within a Sunni caliphate, because he's not serving the Sunni caliph, he's serving the Shia imam, and he's doing it for that reason. So in a way, it's you're in an administration that you don't agree with the head of that administration, but you're doing it for the right reason. That was their argument, in essence. So there was no real incompatibility in that sense between what we call 12 Shias, which are the majority faction of Shias, and a Sunni Caliph. And of course, to give you an example, in Iraq, for example, during the Ottoman times, Ottoman Caliph, you had the Shia shrines were maintained by the Sunni Caliph. As the Sunni Caliph is responsible for maintaining all the religious buildings and in the Muslim world, and included in that were the Shia shrines. So we didn't have that kind of, you could say, 30 years war that you probably saw in Europe. But I'm not going to attribute any particular motivation for the war. I'll leave that to the Christians on the panel to discuss. But that was the issue. As for issue of war and fighting, one of the things I've often found perhaps interesting in the criticism of Islam, especially from, let's say, a Western perspective, is there's this perception that any other way of life or religion that has a concept of just war is somehow barbaric and nasty and brutal. But yet the West itself has a concept of just war which involves proactive invasions of countries deemed to be not following secularism. Now, I'll give you some citations you can study for yourself. So, for example, John Rawls, arguably the 20th century's most foremost liberal philosopher that he was, he wrote a book called The Law of Nations. Read it for yourself. And he discussed in that book that there are pariah states, or states that are not enacting rules or ruling their people by what they consider to be the established norms, or what they consider to be correct rules or laws, have no right to claim inviolability from invasion or attack by a country which is secular and democratic. Which is why you see that any country deemed to be not secular and democratic is fair game to the United States of America and all such countries. But to kind of add to that, he also says something else which I found quite shocking, but perhaps not surprising. He argued for something called the Supreme Emergency Exemption. I don't know if anyone studies political philosophy here. Him and Michael Walzer as well, who's another liberal philosopher who discusses international warfare theory and war theory and international relations. And he said that in certain conditions, if the safety or stability of your country is at threat, or you feel that threat to a degree such that you're in a war, or you need to engage in a war, whereby to win that war you have to target enemy civilians specifically, you can engage in that. And he's called the Supreme Emergency Exemption. And in case people don't believe me, I have a quote here. This is why I have a laptop, to bring up the quotes so people say, do not accuse me of misquoting. So here's an example. And you're going to like this example specifically. So he says, he talks about the Supreme Emergency Exemption, which is the exemption from the usual rule of not targeting civilians specifically. He says, this exemption allows us to set aside, in certain special circumstances, the strict status of civilians that normally prevents their being directly attacked in war. The Catholic doctrine says that one must never act with the intention of attacking the enemy state by means of taking the innocent lives of its civilians. Political liberalism allows the Supreme Emergency Exemption. And then he continues, the statesman is a central figure in considering the conduct of war and must be prepared to wage a just war in defense of liberal democratic regimes. And again, Michael Walzer, who's another famed theorist on just war, echoes this. And they cite as an example World War II, Winston Churchill's targeted bombing of German civilians, including the firebombing of Dresden, as examples of the just application of secular liberal theory on the Supreme Emergency Exemption. And I found it quite interesting that he actually mentioned specifically that this was different. The secular liberal view was different from the Catholic view of double effect. I'd like a nice frame up on your kind of main society wall there, the honorary member.
We should make you the eternal president.
Yes. Where he argued that the Catholic idea was that no matter how beneficial it was or how compelling the circumstances were, you never broke God's law and targeted civilians, no matter how convenient it was. And of course, Islam actually has the same concept as well, which we can discuss. Whereas secular liberalism allows the Supreme Emergency Exemption. So I think this is a case in point to show that secular ethics it can be judged, or not judged, but directed by convenience. and the God of convenience giveth, and the God of convenience taketh away when convenient.
So I wouldn't accuse you of
Can I restrict your questions for a second? We want to get more of the other speakers involved. That's it.
Of course, yeah, okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay, but allow me a rebuttal after everyone else has had a go.
Yeah, sure. Do you have any questions for the other speakers?
Myself, no, I'll let someone else ask a question now. I think that's only fair.
Or make a point.
Or make a point. Indeed.
I would ask you a question then. It seems clear to me, and in the discussion that just happened, that, and I don't think you would make this point, that secular vision of society is not an antidote entirely to violence, oppression, negative forces in society. And I don't think you would make the argument that it is. Or would you?
I would not, obviously.
Okay, good.
Stalinism happened.
Yeah. So my question then is, can you articulate the vision for the progress of society from where we are with a secular vision, taking into account that you have a vastly diverse humanity. You have vastly different religious beliefs and experiences, and people of no belief, and how do you approach, or is there an overarching approach to the development of society from a secular point of view? Because you also asked earlier the question about a centralized authority, and there's obviously nothing as such from a secular point of view. So I would be curious as to your perspective as to how the viewpoint of secularism, widely speaking, exerts itself in society and helps it progress.
It's an interesting one, yeah. You also kind of, a concise way of putting it might be to say, how do you build a just city? Like, how best do you apply the values of secularism, if you like, into actually creating a just society? And the quick, honest, expedient answer is, I have no idea. But neither do you. Neither does Mr. Andalusi. And I think anyone who's arrogant enough to say it might be, well, arrogant. I think it's a lot to say. Although, one thing that I think I can say is that there are very, very obviously problems within society, and we can identify them, and we have a kind of intuitive-ish grasp, unless you're American, an intuitive-ish grasp of the problems of society. And directing your efforts into critically, like, examining the concepts which reinforce why the problems are there, as well as, non-ideological reasons why the problems are there, is something that you can do whether you're religious or no. Mm-hmm. So I don't know how you achieve perfection, but I do know how you improve, would be my response. And I know when I say you improve, you're targeting, you simply target problems that exist. I'm not saying we have an ideology that fixes everything. I'm not trying to say that, and I don't think anyone does yet.
Mm. You mentioned, if I can do one follow-up, you mentioned secular values.
Yeah.
So it's a predictable question I'm going to ask you now. So the question is, what are those, and from what are they derived?
Okay. Secular values is a bad thing to say. I think secularism is a value in itself. I don't think that secular values is a good way of putting it. What I really should have meant to say is, like, non-religious, like, divorced from religion values such as that. Like, for instance, I would value that I not go around, I don't know, punching people in the face, slapping people in the face, chopping people's heads off. These are bad things.
What if they were a Nazi? Wasn't that a debate that happened? Was a debate that happened at UCD a couple of weeks ago? Would you punch a Nazi? Yeah, Nazi. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't think it's nice to punch Richard Spencer. I think it's better to convince him that he's wrong.
Yes.
I think that's more important. And I lost my train of thought because of that. Where was I? Oh,
secular values.
Secular values. Thank you. Yeah. No, I think secular values, like a secular value, you might say is tolerance, pacifism, you might say, love of peace, certainly. It's very, very easy to kind of intuitively grasp what is, by and large, problematic in society and what is kind of valuable. So I know that's very vague, and I know that I'm not really kind of giving you anything very, very solid. But that's just because I don't have the answers. But I try my best.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, go for it.
If those are secular values, then, geez, yeah, I have secular values. Those sound great. I think there's a lot of common shared ground here in terms of addressing like clear abuses in society and allowing and respecting some kind of room for dissent and discussion in society, and not forcing beliefs on people in that sense. There's a famous quote, I think it might be from Pope Benedict, or some famous Catholic guy anyway. I don't need the citation. It's like the church never imposes, only proposes. That's kind of like the ideal there. And I guess I'd also like to raise the point of like, what do we mean by secularism? Because if we mean by secularism, I suppose the ruling out or the elimination of a religion from public society, where it's only you keep it to yourself, it's indoors. It shouldn't be allowed to influence or have a place in any way.
I'm not saying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good. So yeah, because that would be quite unreasonable. But I think it's still the direction that some modern Western countries are going in. For example, France, where there's so huge restrictions, for example, on expressing your Islamic faith. I don't think you're not the whole burkini thing, and that applies to Christian things as well. I mean, just a while ago, a statue of Pope John Paul II in France, which included a cross in it, was found to be unconstitutional by a French judge, and so it has to be removed, and it's getting sent off to Poland instead. Because they loved Pope John Paul II. But anyway, I think that's kind of a disordered vision of secularism. But by secularism we think realizing that faith and society, like the public realm and the realm of religious authority and religious things, that they're distinct things. At the same time, they're not completely. The two can never meet. It's that they can be interconnected, and they have actual things to contribute to each other.
Of course, yeah. And if I might allow a kind of general concession to everyone else, I think the zakat is one of the coolest things ever. Don't get me wrong. I mean Islam. Huh? Oh, pardon me. Yeah, sorry. Islam invented the modern welfare state as we know it. It invented the idea of welfare as a state thing. So I'm not saying that religion can't have bad ideas, or rather, that religion can't have good ideas. It does happen, and I think, as you say, it's kind of unjust to necessarily divorce religion from lawmaking in an absolute capacity, because religions and religious people and religious scholars inspired by religion do produce good ideas, as I've conceded. So yeah, I again.
I'd like to make a point. You said, in a way, anyone who believes that they have some system that, let's say, has a solution to everything is arrogant. And you're right. For someone to say that they have a system that has a solution to everything is arrogant if they were the author of that system. I mean, it's like, to have a perfect system, you need an author that is omniscient, omnipotent. Dare I say,
I know
something? Yes. There's a book I know that written by that author as well. Yes. So of course, no human could advance such a system, and nor should we take it for any human that would advance the system. But of course, as religious believers, we believe that the authors of our respective books have good authority, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
But I also want to mention something about tolerance, because I think that's a very key issue in the modern world today, issue of tolerance and intolerance. France is more intolerant. I think we could all agree then, let's say, some of the English-speaking countries. In France, for example, niqabs are banned in public. You can't pray in public as well in France. I was shocked, but that's absolutely true. They say it's the land of free speech, and yet books are banned by theologians. For example, Ahmed Deedat is a Muslim theologian. He doesn't talk about politics. He generally talks about theology, Christianity, Islam, so on and so forth. And yet I was shocked to discover that at least 2 of his books are prohibited, are prescribed in France, in secular France. Some people said, well, look at England. And I think, well, England, you could say a secular country, although the British Humanist Association or the National Secular Society would actually disagree. They'll say it has an established church. And Edmund Burke argued that because it has an established church, the Anglican Church, that the English never had a worry that any of its minorities, well, in theory anyway, any of its minorities could usurp the state, because however much people followed any different religion or what have you, the state would always be Anglican, and that was part of its constitution. So there was no worry to have different religions, because your state is secure You don't have to worry about fifth columnists or what have you. How they applied that in history is a different discussion, and so on, with Catholics, of course. But Edmund Burke made this argument to say we don't need anti-Catholic laws because we have an established church. And some people have said the reason why England is more tolerant than France is because it actually isn't secular, and therefore had a established position, and therefore you had this acceptance. Same with the Islamic caliphates of old. The caliphate was based on the Quran and Islamic teachings, and therefore there was no worry or concern from minorities that, they're going to change our religion and they're going to force it. So you could each have a place for everyone to have their own religion, their own traditions, their own churches and synagogues and what have you, because you wouldn't have to worry about them changing the national character of your state. But in the nation-state era, you always hear from, whether it's in America, you have the far-right fascists who say, we're worried about this ethnic group changing the national character, or our ethnic group is historically the creators of this country, therefore we deserve some pride of place, or we have to be the ruling faction, otherwise America's changing. And in England as well, there was, especially in immigration, these issues. Now, in Ireland, I haven't seen that discussion so much, but there are the beginnings of that discussion with immigration. So even, I find Ireland welcoming and generally very tolerant, but even here there are some far-right individuals. I even debated a few of them in Galway a couple of years back, where they were saying that Muslims are a threat to this country and so on and so forth. And so on. So these are the issues. So that's kind of my point, is that actually religion provides a basis for tolerance. Again, everyone brings up the Crusades, and I know that Newman Society are going to be loving me after this point. But the Crusades was actually, it's more about plunder and resources, but it was also about a kind of proto-West versus East mindset, because Eastern Orthodox Christians were still Christian, but they were never considered to be part of Western Europe, and they were also killed and attacked, even though they're Christian, right? So it's not really Christianity per se which mandated that Christians go out and massacre and kill. It was some, the remains of the Roman Empire and organizations trying to kind of assert their authority and develop a Western European civilization distinct from others around it, which is an interesting discussion. I want to mention one final thing, and sorry to hog all the time, and I do apologize, but it's actually what you mentioned earlier on about terrorists who cite Islam, and they say that they're going to do what they're doing in the name of Islam is mandated because of their interpretation of the text. Mm-hmm. Now, generally speaking, this is actually, even Muslims think that this is the case, because we've been hearing it on the news. You'll always see after a terror attack, a Muslim pundit is brought on, and the newscaster asks, what do you think about these terrorists who did this act in the name of Islam or in the name of God? And so that's interesting, because they never actually say, we're doing this in the name of Islam. Mm-hmm. They say, get out of our lands, or do not kill our children or civilians. They tend to cite that as their factor, rather than God tells us we have to kill all infidels. They never say this. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to bring one particular case, and I bring this so many times, and I'm going to keep spamming it until it gets through, was an interesting interview with Osama bin Laden that Al Jazeera conducted in 2003. So they spoke to Osama bin Laden, and they said, your war against the West, you've advocated the targeting of Western civilians. How can you do this when Islam and the Prophet Muhammad expressly prohibited the targeting of civilians? Do you not believe that? And he said, yes, that is true. The Prophet Muhammad expressly prohibited it. It's in the Quran, it's in the Hadith, and this is what we accept. And then the Al Jazeera interview was like bewildered. Then why do you do it then? Why do you advocate it then? And his argument was, well, the law's not set in stone. And his argument was that if the West does it to us, then he argued that he should be able to do it back to the West to deter the West from continuing to attack their civilians. So he viewed it as a way of defending or preventing further civilian casualties in the Muslim world by a reciprocal response to the West. This is documented, his response to this. Wasn't an Islamic argument, was no Quranic verse saying massacre infidels or kill them. None of that, because the Prophet Muhammad didn't kill Christians because they were Christian, or kill Jews because they were Jews. None of this stuff. So I would say that his argument sounds similar to John Rawls and Michael Walzer, the supreme emergency exemption, a secular argument, and not a religious argument. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, no, fair enough. And obviously it didn't work out very well for him in the end.
Yes,
Or indeed the people he was supposedly trying to protect.
We'll open the questions to the floor then.
So this is a fairly open question to everyone, but what is the way forward? So when there are so much misinformation and so many people who believe that religion is intolerant, both from outside the religion and from within the religion, how do we start to change the way that we conceptualize the role of religion in society and start to move forward and actually build the world based on the values that everyone basically has agreed upon? Because we all agreed on the values, but what's the next step, and can we agree on the next step?
Well, for starters, anyway, one of my favorite writers, G.K. Chesterton, said that great civilizations fall when people forget the obvious things, and as kind of is seen already, especially in this Western world, even most people, almost everyone, basically ascribes to generally the same values, because you may not be religious, but we live in a culture that's been shaped for thousands of years by religion, and so it's infused with those values. I guess, I think the real issues are kind of obvious there. I'd kind of be a bit brave and say that religion not only does have an answer for creating a better society, it maybe is even the only thing that can solve society's questions and problems. I say that for this reason, that most questions can be viewed in a very kind of status term. So like if you want people to stop doing something, well, you enforce a penalty for it, or you send them to jail, or maybe you sentence them to death or whatever, and you're trying to coerce people. But really, I think that the reason at the same time that religion aims for, it seems it does have the answer, and also that answer is kind of almost going to be eternally just out of reach, because we live in such an imperfect world. There's never been a perfect society. I guess the answer for religion is, well, it's a matter of morals. But all of us try to say we have an idea of what the right thing, and what the right way to act is in any given situation, and the process really isn't so much like we figure that out first, but the process then is conforming ourselves to that truth and trying to do it in practice. Like another quote from G.K. Chesterton: "It's not that people tried religion and found it wanting. It's that people tried religion, found it very difficult, and then left and then gave up without finishing it off, or without actually fully trying it. Because it is difficult. Like, I guess if there was any solution to society's problems, it would be that people just see what is right and they do what's right, and they do what is good and avoid evil. And that's kind of the argument for most religions. And it's just simply kind of realizing that. If there's going to be every solution, is that if people regulated themselves almost because they actually want to do what is good, they want to kind of work on themselves and change themselves to, in any situation, do what is good for both other people and for themselves, and ultimately for everyone else who believes in God, for God will do right by God as well. And it's just if you want to reform the world, reform yourself is another Catholic saying. It's the whole approach to it is you change yourself and you try to live consistently by these values. And I think most of the thing is people have been falling short of these values, if anything, these transcendental values. Even we share them. The ideas of goodness, of justice, of mercy, etc. We kind of share those values in the Western tradition. Even no matter who you are, neoliberal, conservative, whatever, religious or non-religious, we kind of all agree on those kind of transcendental values.
I think there's plenty of people who don't, and that's problematic.
That's the problem.
But by and large, yeah. Right.
And then even then again, for most of us, I guess we kind of agree on what general values we should act by, and then some people have some pretty crazy ideas, like the far right, for example. They're a good example, but the far right, or the really far right, are historically very anti-religious, and they're quite relativistic as well. Like Mussolini was a relative, we kind of espouse a doctrine of relativism, which is enforcing your belief by force instead of by dialogue.
If I might, okay, well, to say that Mussolini is representative of my belief.
Oh no, I'm not saying that at all.
Okay, pardon. Okay, but okay, you said that. I can't fathom why you would condemn the far right when typically the far right has had many Catholic manifestations. If you take Tito, for example, the fascist dictator, who was a priest.
Tito.
Huh? Oh, sorry. Again,
Tito
I'm too meek. Yeah, indeed.
Well, I think like.
Let him make it. Let him make his.
Oh no,
That was it?
Oh yeah.
Oh, essentially. Well, I mean, like,
yeah, no,
but
I think-
also, indeed,
yeah.
like, you know, celebration of the birthday of Hitler every year. Thank you.
Who does that?
The Catholic Church did up until his death.
Who does that? Well, I'd like to see some more. I'd like to see some investigated, see some citations, knowing how anti-Nazi.
Well,
the
actually,
Catholic Church was.
maybe it was an act of God, but all my citations and my speech, I had to rewrite it. My computer shut down, and I lost it. And
We should accept it based on faith, then. You're saying?
perhaps, yeah. Well, I mean, having seen it before, it's not.
Well, I just think I'd address there's a difference because, and you brought up the idea of no true Scotsman earlier. There's a difference between how people in the past who have held or described themselves or even had a post in, like, for example, like a priest that's a position. It's a role in the church. How they've acted and what the objective values of that are. That's why the kind of no true Scotsman doesn't really apply to religions that have an objective body of teaching, an objective way of acting. Because then, for example, if people like Tito, for example, I don't know much about him, but I know he's a very repressive dictator who sends people to death and stuff. Surely that's a result of him not being like a really good adherent to the Catholic faith and applying it in all of his precepts. Surely it's an example of him not applying his faith, because clearly if you want to say that Tito was acting like Jesus and the example of Jesus is what drove him to start a communist revolution in Yugoslavia and send his people to death and whatnot, I don't think that'd be very credible, because you can see they're clearly two very different types of people.
If I may, I don't think you could cite any pope who acted like Jesus. I don't think
you cite anyone who acted like Jesus. That's the whole point. The whole point is that we hold up an ideal. We all hold up ideals of perfection, but of course, being humans, we always fall short of them, because anything that involves human beings is always going to be utterly imperfect. And that's like, I think that's most religions kind of acknowledge that it's almost like we're in such a bad state. We almost need, if anyone could help save us, it would have to be all-powerful God, because we are quite messed up. Like, we've done, like, humanity have done all sorts of terrible things in the past. Like, no one contests that anyone has acted like Jesus, because he was specifically like us in all things but sin.
Okay, hold on. Right. So I take issue.
Okay.
We'll
talk about the popes in the movie.
No. It's not about that. But I think a lot of your responses to really fair critiques of our traditions result in, like, whataboutism. So instead of actually confronting the fact that, like, actually, I don't know. The Baha'is, you're newer to the scene. You haven't had a chance to screw up as badly as the rest of us have yet. But like particularly looking at the Christian tradition, like, the general response is, yeah, but look at these other good things. But that doesn't acknowledge the fact that, like, we have, like, objectively failed on a huge amount of stuff. Like, and have like. And there's a torrid history there within Christianity of ways in which we, as you say, have not just, like, slightly failed to be like Jesus, have manifestly been the opposite of what he's like and the kingdom that he sought to bring. And that for me is kind of troubling. And I think I want to come back to Ilir's question about, like, how we create this better society. Like, I think this is part of it. Like, first of all, like, owning our junk, like, owning the fact that, like actually saying, we did this and this was wrong. It is not acceptable. We need to make reparation and restitution for the ways in which we failed. And until that actually happens, I don't think we can rebuild trust between our religions and the society in which we live, to once again regain a voice that has the capacity to influence without seeking power. The second is, like, and I love this about, like, what this community on campus is about. Like, during I was so moved at our interfaith dialogue recently when we were talking about prayer, and there was this beautiful conversation that happened in the room where there was this seeking out of, like, this commonality that we shared through dialogue, to be like, wow, we have these different expressions and these different things that we believe, but at the heart of it, we found this one beautiful thing that we shared about what prayer does to our hearts. And that was a powerful moment where, like, there was an increased sense of, like, despite our different beliefs on different stuff, we could imagine we could be in the same room in a powerful way as a result of that. So I think seeking our commonality and seeking our common good, and then also, I guess the other thing I would say about, like, as we push forward, it's hard because, yes, we share some transcendental values. The problem is sometimes our definition of justice, mercy, and goodness are very, very different, and that's what I think we need to own as well, is that I have very particular views on certain things. And if somebody doesn't share the bedrock of my faith, they shouldn't share its expression. And I need to know the difference, for me as a religious person, between what is for me, as in terms of how I live to my community, and how I think everyone else should live. Because as soon as I start to get into the business of other people's things, then I'm in really tricky trouble. But I think if we had humility that made us pull back, maybe like that, people would actually come seek us for wisdom about how to live well in this world, rather than if we were trying to enforce it on people all the time. So not all of that was about you.
Jump in there, yeah. No, I think we don't. I think we mostly agree there. Like, I wasn't really saying whataboutism, and I wasn't denying that, like people have done bad things. I'm just saying, that's part of the human condition. And what I'm doing is I'm drawing a distinction between what our values are and what we teach, and of course, and the figure of Jesus, who is supposed to be the epitome of who we're all trying to be, and we look to him for the example, and people like failing to live up to those values. So I don't think you could describe what Catholicism is as simply the sum of what Christians have done or what Catholics have done. It's an objective thing, it's a well kind of established teaching that's based on kind of the example of a historical person who was like without sin, and like we don't say that anyone else was without, apart from maybe the Virgin Mary, who was without sin, was perfectly without sin. So like that's part of the whole point, isn't it? That everyone falls short, everyone fails, and like no one's denying that for Catholics or for anyone. But I'm just saying that the teaching is a different thing. And if, for example, if Tito was a Catholic priest, you couldn't. I don't think you could really make the point that what his actions were a very were reflective of Christ.
Oh, I see.
Or it's a Catholic Church.
Can we take more questions from the floor?
Okay, just very quickly. Just interject just about the issue of power. I'll be quick, honest. The issue of power, power became a kind of a dirty word. We said, power can be destructive. But power is also constructive. You can't construct things without power, without humans cooperating to build things, not Trump's wall, but other things. Then you don't have civilization, you don't have welfare, you don't have farming that feeds people, that feeds the poor. I mean, people say money is a source of evil. Money can also be a source of good when given to charity, when given to develop or invest. So the idea that power is evil and that this world is somehow the realm of the devil and the hereafter is the realm of God, it's not the case, because everywhere is the realm of God. Everywhere is the kingdom of God, to use a biblical term. But what I also say, my point ultimately is really to say that if you believe that you have a purpose of life, it would be absurd to say that your purpose of life is detached from the affairs of life. So the purpose of life of human beings is detached from the affairs of life of human beings. I also think, and then this is perhaps where I might lose my membership in the Catholic Human Society, is the issue of secularism perhaps is confusing, and I would say it's a very Western experience, because there is a debate in Christianity, and especially on the teachings of Paul, as to whether Gentiles should follow the laws of Moses. And the Mosaic laws was one for a state, for a system. It had governance, it had jurisprudence. But when the new covenant of Jesus, is that one where you still have to stick to the old laws? Do you change the laws? Is it just about faith? Is it about faith and acts, or acts as a demonstration of faith? There's all these debates came up, and so in essence the Catholic Church based its argument on its own authority, and it kind of evolved over time for its kind of authority, based on the argument that it is the head of the church and therefore can decide all things in Christian's life. Whereas maybe at the time of St. Paul that wasn't the case, and some people have argued that maybe it was St. Paul just producing an interpretation for Gentiles, whereby Gentiles didn't have to follow the law, but Jews still had to follow the law. Jewish Christians still had to follow the law. And this kind of debate as to where do you draw the line? Do you still honor the Sabbath? Do you still abstain from eating pork, which is obviously in the Old Testament? All these things are still debated in Christianity. Anyway, so all these things are still debated, and I suppose that I posit might be where there is some area of confusion, whereas from Islam we didn't have that kind of St. Paul teaching whereby you have the separation or this worldly state or this hereafter state or what have you.
Any more questions from the floor? Yeah.
I think in Europe we're seeing sort of a realization of more secular society, or more secular people in society. And one thing is that the birth rate in most of the EU has plummeted significantly. And I think there's, as far as I can tell, there's only about 2 countries in Europe, Ireland being one of them, that can sustain their population significantly. And I think likely that's probably due to immigrants coming in and actually having children. So where there's say Muslims coming from the Middle East and coming into Europe, they're actually, contributing to society in a wider way by having children, which is something that Westerners have stopped doing. So what's this sort of solution? Because as far as I can see, that when you hold secular values, there's not really much need to have children because you should focus on your career, or why would you bother having children? Because in the end, it doesn't really matter. That's the kind of the question. I'm kind of addressing that as in two.
Shane.
Yeah, Shane, and then the rest on how do we sort of approach, or even just to introduce religious ideals into the secular people, rather than maybe if we think it's a good idea to take on these ideals, or why, what's the conflict there? That's the overall question.
Okay, that's interesting. Right. I'm lost. Yeah.
On the part of the question, or just?
Yeah. Well, I don't understand.
Generally.
I was curious. Well, generally, yeah. No, always.
You're going to be quoted out of context on that.
You can quote me in context. That's fine. No, okay. I don't know that we have a reducing unsustainable. When you talk about unsustainable population, you mean it's going down or
aging
going
population?
up?
No, the aging population does not. People aren't reading.
Aging, but also people are having less and less children. So
I see.
in Europe, it's France, I think, and Ireland who have 2 children per household roughly. It's actually less in Ireland. It's 1.98 children per people each generation has. So that's falling. In certain places, they might have 1 child. Like, for example, if we've seen in China, they have a 1-child policy.
Mm-hmm.
But in Japan, where their population is rising rapidly.
Which is a weird, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a kind of thing of sort of Western society that people move away from religion and they stop having children. But when you're old and you've no one to look after you, and like that's the kind of problems that a secular society has to address. And I think there's literally probably only even Christianity is facing that kind of problem. That a lot of Christians don't have children as well. I'm very happy to see that at least Islam is having children.
Yes. Well.
Look, I only got married 3 months ago. Give a man a chance.
It just seems like it's the only sort of major world religion where you can really see, have children is the right.
Okay. Well, you're asking me how I solve problems of aging population, and it's not my area. I have no idea. I'm sorry. That being said, I think it's interesting that you mentioned that religion would be something that you'd bring into it to try and bring that population up. I don't know that you need to not have children if you're an atheist, for example. I certainly agree that atheists and secular societies generally have a lower birth rate, and I'm not really prepared to comment on why necessarily. Yeah, I think there's more everyone else would have to say on the matter.
I still wonder about the impact of Christianity on the Western world by how we have tended to shame sexuality, which has made it more attractive to people in a way that has led to more children. There's a so that's led to a kind of an interesting context. I think what's I think your question kind of assumes like the net good of the idea of having more children and replenishing. I would wonder about the place that all religions have in creating a society where no matter what our demographics are in terms of how things are shifting, we create a more fair, equal and just society for all age groups. So that, if we're at some point you're going to come to a breaking point where you have this massive aging population and you're we need to make more kids so that they can, so we can create a situation where they'll, their money will pay the pensions of all these old people. Well, maybe we just need a better economic system that actually looks after people and that actually takes care of people.
My question was more as in, what's the point of having children? Not
okay.
It's like, and we're sort of approaching a kind of really advanced technological age where there's things like in vitro fertilization.
Sure.
And even with CRISPR gene editing, like there's been speculation that we won't even age at a certain point. It's kind of like that question is, why would you have children in the first place?
I don't know if there's. I mean, I don't personally feel a biblical mandate to have children. Like, I don't feel like my faith requires me to have children.
Well, wait. I'll stop right there. Second.
No, I will continue with my opinion because that's how it works.
The second commandment God gives man, I think it maybe even be the first one, that directive that God gives to like humankind in Genesis is, go forth and be fruitful.
Yeah, I'm very fruitful. I have a productive life, but I don't. But like, does that mean then that say the Christians who don't get married then don't live fruitful lives?
No, I'd respond to the idea that Christianity has shamed sexuality when really it seems like.
Oh, change the subject.
No. I'm just addressing the wider context here. Okay, so what you're saying is that basically. Christianity has kind of shamed sexuality in the past, and well, that's one thing I want to catch on to. What was your second point again? I can just see where were you?
I was saying I don't feel a mandate to have children.
Oh yeah, no, I don't. Yeah, well, that's not really like. I don't think anyone's saying that you do, but I kind of.
You did argue.
He did, right?
I think what Neil has talked about here is kind of a wider kind of. Attitudes to kind of the whole economy of like the human life cycle, so to speak. I think that's kind of like the main point here. Like, why have children? That kind of addresses the idea of can people have is there a basis for objective values in secularism? Like how science can say what is, but science or secularism or can't really say. Should you do something? You can only look at reality. It's not really in the realm so much of what you should do of normativism. That's just an area to just touch on. It's kind of relevant as well. But what can bring a kind of a life affirming and kind of a really that can solve this problem. And yeah, that's one thing that like demographically speaking, Muslims, for example, have far more children. They've got a much more. I think it's kind of it's a general kind of ethos and approach to the whole thing. I think historically speaking, Catholics poor Catholics were kind of well known to have like. Yeah, poor Catholics kind of in places like Germany and also Ireland as well. Kind of historically had big families as well. No, but I think that that religion can actually offer kind of a solution to that, because. And this is the whole thing. This is why I want to kind of like offer an alternative view to the idea that Christianity shames sexuality. I think that for example, modern like teaching on like what the family is, what a man, woman, and child are. They're like a man and woman. A family is like the image of God, is the image of the Trinity. That's like that kind of. It exalts kind of fruitfulness and like bring forth new life and human sexuality to almost like a whole new level. I think I just think it can have that approach to it, and that's kind of a wider kind of ethos thing. I think that's kind of more borne out by kind of historical evidence, so to speak. But I think in some specific areas as well, kind of as the religion has declined, kind of there's been new prospects for kind of the human race almost to kind of commit suicide in a way, and that's kind of there's lots of different areas. That's like for example. Some side options would be like examples of this were like the advent of nuclear weapons, for example, where never before have we had this is kind of not so much a danger anymore, but never before have we had the opportunity to wipe ourselves out, so to speak. And also there's climate change as well. Never before have we been in a position where we could almost end human life in general if this keeps going on and we don't do something about it. This is something. But I think the specific one I want to address here is things like I'll keep it quick.
Okay.
Contraception and things like that, and just exactly.
Okay.
No. I think this is important. I think this is relevant because it teaches kind of an ethos that, like, if you're going to talk about the birth rate, you're going to talk about things that are relevant to that. Okay, and so there's a whole range of things that that modern society practices quite a lot, which maybe are part of the declining birth rate, such as mass contraception. And a range of other things as well, which religions are often, I guess, like I know there's views on Islam to do with abortion as well. Like these are things that are relevant to the question of children being born. Okay, and I think that's clear that the religions have solid like tenets. I know the Catholic Church does, and I know in certain areas as well Islam does. I'm just not an expert. That actually, yeah, I'm finished now. That answer this specific question. So I think it actually does have something that to contribute to that area, that question in general.
Just a quick response to the guy who said that Islam requires more children. Firstly,
I didn't say that. I was just saying that generally they do. Like people
Statistically.
in Islam are having more.
you said Islam's having more children. Well, I was going to say, firstly, thank you for suggesting a new chat line for Muslim men to use. But Islam needs to have children. But also, I'd say that the demographics with any immigrant that comes into a country, the birth rate is usually higher, but over time it then levels out and matches the birth rate of the host population and so on and so forth. So I don't think there's no worry of any kind of Muslim demographics. In that sense, eclipsing the rest of the population. But generally speaking, the point is really to say is this: in the modern world, when this family is no longer kind of the locus of society, it's actually the state. The state is like the kind of surrogate family that people kind of resort to for help and for support and for in their old age, whereas previously it would be the younger generation helping out the elderly. So the younger generation within a family. But because we don't have that anymore, people are kind of looking to the state, and perhaps because the state is always going to be there, they don't feel the need to have children to kind of look after them in their older age. Maybe that's a reason. There's maybe another other issues as well, such as, if you want to believe some far-right conspiracy theorists, was it chlorine in the water that's designed to destroy fertility, or some part of some nefarious fluoride or what have you? Yeah.
Can I just make a quick clarification? Yeah, sorry. I wasn't making the point that Orthodox Christianity shames sexuality. I think toxic forms of Christianity in the past have shamed sexuality, making it more attractive to people by being prohibitive about it, and then therefore people end up making unhealthy, uneducated decisions about it. I think Orthodox Christianity celebrates sexuality.
We'll just have one last question. We'll limit the answers to 1 minute each.
This should be pretty easy. Could each member of the panel define spirituality and what spirituality means to them individually, please?
No one wants to step up first to the parapet, it would seem.
Politics, no problem, but spirituality. I guess I personally would say that for me, spirituality is about my relationship with the transcendence, and it's about my relationship with I love that there's a verse in Hebrews that says, "For faith is being sure of what we're certain of what we hope for, and sure of what we cannot see." And so there's this tension that lives in spirituality, that like you have this surety and certainty in something that you cannot prove, and therefore cannot enforce in others. And yet it's almost like behind the curtain at all times there is this. Behind the curtain is filled with the goodness of the God who is always breaking his way into that. And I think spirituality is quietening myself down enough to get in touch with that God who I believe came into the world and died and was raised from the dead as Jesus.
Oh, me now. In order of beards. Again.
That's what we should call ourselves, guys, the Order of the Beard.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, but then we'd have to I guess it's a tricky one because it's been a while since I've felt spiritual, but I would describe it as the kind of sense of supernatural or supersensory profundity that people receive, particularly when they witness great forms of art, and indeed religious experience would be how I would think about it personally. And that was not Andalusi short. That was Shane Lister short.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think spirituality has a significant part to play both in our individual lives and in the life of society. And that our spiritual aspirations really have to come down to they have their foundation in a twofold moral purpose. As individuals, we have, I think, the internal, you could say God-given or just inherent drive to connect to something transcendent, to connect to God, to connect to a larger spirit that animates the cosmos. There's a drive for us to connect to that, and a very personal connection to God that motivates us to develop our characters, to manifest what we call spiritual values, love, general goodness and justice in ourselves. And then there's also the spiritualization of society. And as individuals with a spiritual consciousness, it's also our duty to contribute to the spiritualization of society. So through our interactions with others in our work, in our study, but most importantly in our communities. I think it was said earlier that an event like this is a great example of a way forward. And I think that's exactly right, because we're seeing very clearly that we actually share values. Almost to a T. We share the values of what we consider to be righteous and good and how we should be in society. We have different ideas maybe of the particulars and how to achieve those things. But if we can take those walls down between us, work together on those things that we agree with, and bring them to bear on our communities, on our interactions, and how we live our daily lives, I think that's living up to our inherent nobility. And that's the I think we always have to be mindful that spirituality should manifest itself as an individual experience and also as a wider societal experience.
Perhaps I'll give, contrary to my usual responses, I'll give a very brief definition. I'd say that spirituality is making God the intent behind something. So if you work because by means of that work you want to support your family, you want to get involved in charity, or to even build a house for your family, or do all kinds of such things, having behind that the intent of pleasing God and acting in accordance with what God has ordained for us, then that's spiritual. That is a spiritual action. Money can be spiritual. Then business can be spiritual. Sex can be spiritual too, if you're doing it for the right intent. And I'm not saying you don't enjoy it. You enjoy it, but it's because you're doing it in the right context. You're not committing adultery or what have you. Or that becomes spiritual. And we have a narration from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he said he was teaching people that they would get rewarded for just going and having intimacy with their wives. And so the people were like surprised by this, thinking, how are we going to be rewarded by God for doing something that we enjoy? And then the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, well, wouldn't you expect that you'd gain a sin by doing it outside of marriage or committing adultery? He said, well, yes. Well, then of course you're going to get reward for doing it in what is permissible, what God has ordained, to paraphrase the narration. So everything that a Muslim does is from our perspective, is spiritual. There is no this world and next world. There is doing actions in this world in pursuit of what is above all things, which is God.
I really like this question. I think it's very cutting. It gets to the heart of this whole debate in an interesting way. Just quickly saying what I find spiritual personally, I think my answer is very similar to my distinguished friend from the Atheist Society gave, in that it's that feeling of profundity, that transcendent feeling of things, things that are beyond you, things like beauty and art and that type of thing, and I think that speaks to something that's true about humanity, and that's something that only religion really, a part of humanity that only religion really addresses. It's this idea that human beings they're different from animals. They're not just flesh and bones and blood and messy whatever, like biology. They have another aspect to them that's different, that kind of sets them apart. And I think this reaches into something kind of wider, because we are so different from animals, and I think spirituality is like, what is spiritual is the things that we appreciate that are relevant to the part of our being that separates us from animals, which is the stuff that appreciates objective concepts, that can think, that has free will, that has that loves truth and beauty and justice and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's something that's shown that's an integral part of humanity by the fact that spirituality or even our primitive religion or whatever has just been basically omnipresent in all societies, like completely. Like there's no society that's been found that didn't have some kind of awareness or idea, or even just an intuitive taking it for granted that there's something beyond us in this world. There's something transcendent, and I think that's just, it says something about what it is to be human and what true human nature is. And it's something that religion really speaks to, that we don't really, and that there's outside of religion there's not really much that deals with that side of us and why we are so different. Like we hear how similar we are to animals, but like 99, we're like 98% the same DNA as gorillas or something like that, or maybe it's apes, I'm not sure. But that's religion's really the main thing, talking about why are we so different if we're so similar at the same time, And I think that's like tying it into like what we're talking about religion and society at the moment. I think that should, like, in as much as spirituality and awareness of the transcendent is something that's really deeply human, and religion is something that addresses that part of us. Of course, it belongs in in society, like everything else that is human. With every other aspect of humanity, it's there in the center, in the middle of everything, And so I think that's because it's so universal. It's human. It belongs there, just like everything else does. It has a right to have its say. So that's kind of my take on spirituality, what it is for me, and how it is such a universal human thing, and what that says.
So I think this is a good note to end the discussion on. I hope everyone here enjoyed it, and I'd like to thank the distinguished speakers here today. And
Really good. Go back to your core. Maybe it makes it the time I walk to the umbrella. You did? No. Oh, it's done. Oh.